Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Every day we're talking about what's happened in the US. Our markets frequently take their lead from Wall Street, and the political decisions made in the States ripple out around the world. So I wanted to get an update on what's happening on the ground there, the fallout from the withdrawal from Afghanistan, how Americans are adjusting to living with COVID, and what the huge amount of stimulus is doing for the US economy. And of course, tomorrow marks the 20th anniversary of the September 11 terror attacks. Matthew Knott is the United States correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age and joins us this morning. Matthew, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Hi, Sean. How's it going?
Very well, thank you. Now, you wrote a great piece earlier this week about the 20th anniversary of September 11. What's the difference between the US now compared to 20 years ago, prior to September 11?
There are quite a few. The big thing I found looking back on that period after the September 11 attacks was the type of rhetoric that was being used by George Bush, who was president then. The sense of what America could achieve in the world in terms of spreading democracy. The attacks were not interpreted in a very narrow way about this is an attack from Al-Qaeda and here are the reasons, albeit terrible, why they did this. From the very instant the attacks happened, it was interpreted as an attack on liberty, and an expansive response was seen as something that was called for, starting in Afghanistan, becoming this big nation-building program, and then extending into Iraq. There's such a different atmosphere here in Washington now. I'd say the kind of doves, the people who are calling for a more restrained role for America, have a lot more influence here, and you're seeing that through Joe Biden in Afghanistan. His approach is much more, what are our strict national security interests, rather than how do we create a world that looks more like America. The second thing I would say is just the level of division in the country. You saw after 9/11 that George W. Bush's approval rating went up to 88%. And it stayed very high for several months. It wasn't just the week after. Americans really came together for quite a while. And that seems to be impossible now, even with a crisis like COVID. There's been no sense of the nation coming together. Something like COVID has only torn conservatives and progressives further apart. So there are two ways that the country is very different.
I lived in the US before 9/11 and immediately after 9/11. I thought that the country became a lot softer immediately after 9/11. And so this is the whole George Bush unity, bringing people together. So what's happened since sort of 06, 07? Then you had the Obama years and then, of course, Trump, that has caused it to become as divisive and as anti many things, radical Islam particularly. What's caused it to become so divisive over that period?
I think you'd have to look at the media diet here and social media on top of that as two of the really big things. I'm thinking back to 9/11. Fox News did exist then, but people were living in more of a mainstream media, 6 o'clock nightly news climate. Now, living in completely different worlds depending on the media you consume, and it's so much more about national politics rather than local politics. You add on the internet into that when you've got things like vaccines now are super controversial and super partisan, super polarized. Why is that? Well, it's because of all the nonsense and inaccurate things that people are getting through social media. So I think that's a big part of it. The other thing you'd have to look at is the economy now compared to 2000, 2001. Obviously, things weren't perfect then, but I think there was the sense that things were on the up. It was a good time economically. And since then, you've seen the global financial crisis, you've seen inequality widen, you've seen manufacturing just completely disappear to places like China. So people just feel less secure. They feel less invested in the American dream. Even America is such a place that, is so proud of itself and believes in American exceptionalism, believes that it's the best country in the world. And many Americans now don't believe that's true either from the right or the left. So they're kind of angry.
What about the withdrawal from Afghanistan? How unpopular a war was it by the end? And did Joe Biden make the right decision?
It was a very unpopular war by the end, but not unpopular in the sense that people were thinking about it. It wasn't something that was on the news. It wasn't something that was dominating daily lives. I think it was just a more feeling of why on earth are we still there 20 years later? What are we getting out of this? Why are we spending money in the Middle East when we could be spending it here in America or focusing on more contemporary challenges like China. So opinion polls do show that support for getting out of Afghanistan was very high, but I think people were shocked by the images that came out, by how quickly the Afghan military and government collapsed. I think it was quite unsettling for people here, given how much time and money and lives had been lost over there, that it seemed to have added up to so little. And it was definitely a big blow for Biden. He'd had a pretty good run up till then in terms of getting vaccines rolled out and bringing America back onto the world stage after Trump. It had been pretty easy in a lot of ways for him. And he didn't handle it well in terms of pulling off the withdrawal. Clearly, the intelligence was very wrong. There's big questions to be asked why they didn't wait for a little bit longer, not years, but to get through that peak fighting season in Afghanistan. And his communication was very bad through this crisis in Afghanistan. You know, some of the big days when Kabul fell, even when America actually withdrew, he wasn't visible. He didn't appear in public, and he wasn't very reassuring in terms of what he was saying. He was very defensive in the way he was going about it. So, look, I think most Americans are still glad to be out of Afghanistan. That people are not clamoring to send people back. But I think it was a big blow for Biden's sense of competence and his sense of credibility. It's been a hit for him.
Stay with me, Matthew. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Matthew Knott, United States correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. So you've also written that the new threat is China, and galvanising the country around a threat is always a good thing for any leader. And it seems to be China and perhaps Russia and cyber attacks to a lesser extent, and even perhaps nuclear proliferation. Tell us about that.
China is definitely the big one. That was, looking back at the language around the threat, the war on terror, the threat of radical Islam back 20 years ago. That is the type of language that you see from politicians here in Washington now, both Republican and Democrat. There is an agreement that the geopolitical struggle with China is the big issue of the age. I think it is primarily right now an economic one. Big investments are going through Congress in terms of semiconductors, in terms of technology, in terms of 5G. There's a real sense that America has slipped in investment in these technologies of the 21st century, and it's calling for a bigger role for government in that. The private sector is not going to do it alone, and even many Republicans are on board with that, who are coming from a Reaganite kind of small government point of view. The sense that America has to take on China in an assertive way is bipartisan. It's one of the few bipartisan issues here in Washington. Then you've got the military threat, which is, I think, a little bit more down the track, but is looming there. The sense of, if something was to flare up in Taiwan, would America or China win this war? It's not seen as a fait accompli by any means that America would necessarily win. So both sides of politics are galvanized by this. There are some people who warn, let's not blow this out of control. We don't want to get ourselves into a war with China. Let's keep this, practical and compete with them where we need to, but don't provoke them unnecessarily. But it's definitely going to be the big issue of the next 20 years will be the struggle between America and China, rather than what we've seen over the past 20 years with the focus on the Middle East.
Could it emerge as a Cold War, something like Russia-America in the 60s, 70s, 80s?
It's definitely kind of going that way, and some people speak explicitly about that. I spoke to Rick Scott, who's a senator from Florida, a Republican, very influential, and he says we are in a new Cold War with China, incredibly hard line. He wants to do things like boycott the Olympics that are coming up in Beijing, the Winter Olympics, and things like that, and completely basically decouple the US from China. You see this in another way. Biden is organizing, it's a little bit delayed, but he wants to organize this summit of democracies, bringing democratic nations together in a kind of loose alliance to go up against countries like China and Russia. So you can see this sense of a new Cold War developing in many ways. I think there's going to be many, many similarities. The difference would be, I think, from the old Cold War is that the China and the US are more interconnected. It's more of a globalized economy. the two nations depend on each other more in terms of exporting and importing, which would hopefully, deter them from going to war against each other, given they depend on each other economically.
Matthew, you've written that America is now an angrier, more divided nation than it was 20 years ago. Can that be fixed?
I don't see it going in a great direction right now. We're not even in an election year this year, and there's still enormous divides here. You've got things like Texas, which is the second most populous state in the nation. Its population is about the same as Australia. They've just introduced these incredibly restrictive abortion laws, encouraging people to essentially act as law enforcement, private citizens. That's so different from what is going on somewhere like New York or California, the other big states, which are now becoming so progressive and have left-wing governments. There's just different countries within the country here. You're going to have elections next year and then leading up to 2024, whether Trump is coming back.
Is he?
This is the big question that everyone debates and trying to get inside Trump's head.
He's not even sure.
I don't think he is personally sure, and it would be in his interest to string it out for a little bit longer. My personal assumption is that he will, particularly if he senses that Biden is weak, or if he could go up against Kamala Harris. Then I don't see why he wouldn't do it. He's already created the excuse for himself that if he loses, it's because of fraud. So he can just use that line again if he was to lose. But he would win the nomination if he wanted it. So I personally think he will run. Some people think that he's just going to string it along and then not. But that is going to be the big thing to watch in coming years.
On the pandemic, about 65% of adult Americans have now been fully vaccinated, which here in Australia you would be delighted at that number. However, you wrote last month that the US had a chance to crush COVID, but didn't really hit the anti-vax wall. What happened?
It is exactly that. I think it's not going to be too many months until Australia has overtaken America, which had, up there with the UK and Israel, the earliest rollout in the world. America, some of these are American companies. The vaccines are being manufactured here at enormous scale. I can walk 5 minutes down the road from my house to a CVS chemist and get a vaccine for free. It's very easy. They've been widely available to the whole nation since about May. Anyone who'd wanted to can get one for free. But around that, Joe Biden set the target of July 4 to have 70% of adults vaccinated, which when he announced it seemed very possible. And, he'd been exceeding every target he'd ever hit. And then it became clear that, they're not going to get there. The vaccine hesitancy, as it was called, which is really vaccine resistance and refusal, was strong. About a third of the population does not want to get it. And that's led to this summer surge in infections and deaths. In places like Florida, it's worse than it's ever been, even though we're living in this vaccine era in terms of people dying, particularly in the South. So it just has been disappointing. In many ways, life is very much back to normal. There's an emphasis on freedom here. The vaccines are there. If you want to get it, you can live pretty much freely. But summer's just coming to an end here. And the fact that Delta has surged, school is going back. Parents are really worried about their unvaccinated kids at school. There's all these debates about should school kids be wearing masks. It's just created this sense of frustration and a bit of anger that things have not gone as well as they should have, given how freely available vaccines have been, and watching other countries in the world overtake America. It has been a bit upsetting, really.
And just finally, Joe Biden this week's declared Americans are experiencing a spate of global warming-induced national disasters, Hurricane Ida being the latest example where dozens of people were killed. He's also travelling to Glasgow in November for the climate summit. It sounds like Joe Biden is really serious about climate change.
Yes, he's very serious about this. It's also been a good way to change the conversation from Afghanistan, which wasn't going very well. But he is committed to climate change. I think the big question for the Biden administration and America in this whole discussion is how are they going to deliver on the commitments that they've made? He had a climate summit in April, and he announced new, very ambitious emissions reduction goals, much more ambitious than what Australia has announced. But how are they actually going to make it happen? Congress is incredibly gridlocked. Republicans don't want to do anything about reducing emissions in a meaningful way or taking on things like coal. Even some Democrats, like Joe Manchin, they come from coal-producing states. Hard to get things like a carbon tax through Congress. That's not going to happen. So the question is, how is Biden going to deliver on his promises? I think the thing we're going to be looking for is some big regulations that he can do through his agencies, essentially with the stroke of a pen, around vehicle emissions, around old coal plants. That's what we're going to be looking for in the lead up to Glasgow, because otherwise, how can America lecture the rest of the world about what it's doing if all it's doing is setting theoretical targets that it's not going to meet?
Matthew, I reckon you're enjoying yourself in Washington.
Oh, it's a lot of fun, yeah.
Well, you always enjoy yourself. You enjoyed yourself in Canberra, I know that. But a big difference between the two?
Yeah, Washington is a bit bigger, a little more lively. As much as I enjoyed Canberra, but then again, it is dangerous. This is America. People get shot quite regularly, even near where I live. That side of it is not something that I would want to be imported to Australia. The kind of gun crime that is very normalized here is pretty disturbing.
Keep doing what you're doing, Matthew. Thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was Matthew Knott, US correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.